the title of our journal, Public Knowledge, we think can also be taken as an opposition between public knowledge as opposed to private knowledge. And a lot of times people that are outside the university maintain the ivory tower metaphor, that this is really a site of private knowledge. What we're generating or producing here isn't really reaching outside of our walls. So as private outlets of intellectual production, if we're considered that way, or if we do tend to be that way, how can we make our knowledge more accessible? So how can private knowledge be made more public?
Yeah. Since I was on this production, validation, circulation kick, I stuck with it. If you think about the way academics set research agendas, are there any ways that they could set those research agendas in more democratic fashion, so that they don't research things which, by their definition, are so esoteric that no one else is interested in them? One is that academics don't just live in ivory towers; they also live in laundromats and supermarkets and so on and so forth. And I think one of the things that they should do is not be so apologetic about saying what they do for a living. What do you do for a living? I teach. It's an easy answer. They say, well, actually, I research the geographical imaginary of Irish nationalism. Is a different answer, and it's an answer which will produce a more interesting follow-up than I teach. So what's that? And I think academics have to be evangelical about answering the so what question. They must always answer them. They must look for opportunities to answer the so what question, however mildly threatening that might be. Secondly, I think that people talk about collaborative research, and many academics do it, and I think more academics would do it with a little encouragement to do it. But collaborative research would mean understanding who the end users for your knowledge might be, and working with them in the framing of research questions. And some of the research grant-giving bodies require this now. The Economic and Social Research Council in England, in Britain, requires this. You have to identify end users, and you have to show that you have a committee of end users that have been part of the discussion about framing the question. And this I think is a healthy thing. I don't think that this is a bad thing, and I don't think it's the same thing as useful knowledge. I don't think it's the same thing as knowledge which is narrowly utilitarian. The end users for non-utilitarian knowledge exist. It's just that the knowledge is not technical in that sense. I think people have sort of shied away from engaging in collaborative research because they've too often understood it as purely utilitarian. Where do we put the bus stop? Whereas an end user question might be, why don't people use buses? Or how democratic is the bus space? How do we make the bus more interesting? Do we put Wi-Fi on it, and so on and so forth? So that's the first thing in terms of production. In terms of validation, academics hardly ever accept the validation of their work by non-academics. In a sense, this is what all professions do. All professions, doctors say only doctors can judge doctors. Lawyers say only lawyers can judge lawyers, and the police say only the police can consider questions of misconduct within the police. This is a way that professions preserve their privilege. This is a way that they reproduce their kind, but it's not a particularly healthy thing. This sort of professions ought to be able to explain their practices to people who aren't professionals. And the model I would have would be something like a court of law, where a forensic scientist can't come in and say to the jury, look, you're not going to understand this, but believe me, the science shows. Because the forensic scientist has to convince the jury. So that in a court of law, we're used to this idea that knowledges have to move across. I think academics need to accept more non-professional review of their work. They could include non-academics or non-professional academics on the editorial boards of journals, and such as yours. I don't know if you've got any non-students or any, you might anticipate having readers who aren't other students, and therefore you might be interested in broadening your editorial board. Academics can try to publish their work in non-academic places as well as in academic places, and that means that they would be subjecting their work to a different set of gatekeepers. So I think there are things that can be done in terms of the validation of knowledge. And then in terms of access or circulation, this is an incredibly important issue for universities. As a general principle, I would say that anybody that works for a public institution or a charitable institution should not be allowed, as part of their conditions of work, to produce knowledge which is completely privately appropriated. Because there is a public function, both in the state institution and in the charitable status that educational institutions have. And therefore, I think the public has a right to this knowledge as part of collective knowledge. Now, there is a difference, I think, between knowledge and the commercial exploitation of a technology. So, we have patents, and patents are a way of placing in the public realm the knowledge while allowing private commercial exploitation of that knowledge as a technique. And yet we have allowed a situation where entities can commission research that's undertaken by academics who work either in state institutions or in private universities which have charitable status, and where that knowledge is a private property right. Not the application of the knowledge, but the knowledge itself. This is incredibly dangerous. It allows, let's say, let's take an example of a medicine. If a medicine hardly ever works or doesn't work, the chances are someone's going to get a bit better sometimes, and you have a statistical test, and you'll say, okay, we've done these tests, and the medicine only appeared to work 1% of the time. Therefore, we will conclude that it probably doesn't work with 99% confidence that it probably doesn't work. Well, if I commission 200 studies, it means 2 of them are probably going to show that the medicine worked. If I own the other 198, I can put them in a drawer. I can then publish the 2 that show the medicine worked, see a bump in my share values, cash it in, move on. And that's an egregious use of private property rights, and we know it takes place. We know it takes place in the tobacco industry. We know it has taken place in the tobacco industry. We know it takes place in pharmaceuticals, but it's a broader issue. In other words, knowledge should be public. Applications and techniques can be patented and a private property, but knowledge is a collective entity. It only exists. What was it that Newton said? I can only do what I do by standing on the shoulders of giants. And to stand up there and say, there's nobody holding me up, well, you'll fall on your backside. So as a general principle in terms of the circulation of knowledge, I would want to make a very strong distinction between knowledge and the application of knowledge. Now, in terms of the circulation of knowledge, just a little more generally, most of the knowledge that academics produce is circulated through privately owned journals and so on, and they're very, very expensive. And that restricts access. If you're in a small community college, or even here, we don't have access to all the journals that I regularly use. Virginia Tech doesn't. In Germany, the universities banded together, and they went to Elsevier, and they went to the other big publishers and said, you'll cut one deal with the German academic community, and we will all have access to all journals, or you'll get no journals into our universities. I think that the Commonwealth of Virginia could get its public libraries and its state colleges and universities together and go and cut some general deals, and the US certainly could. And we're not doing that, and we're being played off against each other, and one university thinks it's a little bit better than another university because it's got 5% more electronic journals, and we're all paying far too much and getting far too little access.